Hi, this is Paul Stimers with K&L Gates. I'd like to thank the Museum of Science Fiction, the Escape Velocity program, and the technical team putting this together. Very excited to introduce a conversation on Artemis and going back to the moon with our special guests. First, I'd like to introduce Andy Weir. Andy is a former software programmer who gained notoriety by putting Matt Damon in yet another place from which we have to rescue him. His debut novel, The Martian, comes out swinging right in the first sentence and keeps going straight through to the end. His fantastic second novel, Artemis, is dedicated to the Apollo Command Module pilots, which is a classy touch. Andy writes serious science fiction that is a joy to read, and he has done a lot of thinking and imagining about how we occupy celestial bodies. Dr. C. Alex Young is the Associate Director for Science in the Heliophysics Science Division at NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center. He runs the division's education and public outreach team and works with division scientists to promote and support their research. In graduate school at the University of New Hampshire, Alex studied the high-energy astrophysics of cosmic gamma ray bursts and gamma ray solar flares. He joined NASA after graduate school as a solar astrophysicist with the Extreme Ultraviolet Imaging Telescope. He is an expert on solar image processing and has a significant online presence, including a great website at thesuntoday.org. Alex also has some of the coolest shoes I've ever seen. Maybe if we have nicely, he'll show us. So I'd like to bring on Andy and Alex. Thank you very much for joining us this evening, and welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
So our topic today is the Artemis program specifically, and the quest to return to the moon, this time to stay, to put the next man and the first woman on the surface of the moon, and to work and live on the moon in a sustainable fashion. It's an incredible goal, one that we've worked toward for many years. And one, of course, Andy, that you presuppose the success of in a lot of ways in your own novel, Artemis. And so I'd be curious to hear your perspective, Andy, on the program as somebody who's done, as I mentioned in my intro, a lot of the thinking and imagining about how we occupy the moon. And then, Dr. Young, I'd be very interested in your thoughts from a NASA perspective about how all this is unfolding.
Well, I mean, obviously, I'm pretty stoked about any concept of going, well, frankly, anywhere outside of low Earth orbit, to me, is a win nowadays. Like, so I'm happy for NASA to be headed into the moon. I'm happy for NASA to be headed into Mars. I don't care where they go, as long as it's a little bit further out than where we've been recently. Not to knock ISS, it's an amazing lab, but you know, the science fiction author in me wants to see flags and footprints. I'm the first to admit it. And yeah, I'm super excited about the Artemis program, and I hope it continues. The problem is with NASA, it's each new administration just kind of sets new goals, and it's very difficult for them to. I mean, you can't do a major mission like this in 4 or 8 years. You need multiple administrations to kind of stay the course, and that in practice hasn't been happening. So we'll see how it goes. But I'm hopeful. I'm certainly hopeful.
Yeah,
Fair enough.
yeah, and
Alex,
I'm hopeful too, because I'm hoping, because we have made enough of an investment, I'm hoping that the momentum is there. Again, I just, as Andy said, I've seen the changes in administrations, which has always been a challenge, the change in direction. But my hope is, now that we really have a detailed plan laid out, we're making huge progress. We have a great deal of support from private industry. I mean, private industry has been a critical part. There's a very, very important partnership between private industry and NASA, as well as international collaboration. These are very well established, and they're much more established than they have been in the past, and they're also much more successful, because, of course, this type of stuff takes time. And so we have seen the successes of SpaceX and making the steps of getting having autonomous flights to bring supplies up to the ISS, and now bringing humans to the ISS. And so that is a huge, huge step, because one of the biggest issues that is limiting what we can do outside of low Earth orbit is the cost. The cost of putting stuff, the cost of putting mass into space is a lot. We're talking, somewhere around $10,000 a kilogram, roughly, and that's expensive. And as I'm sure Andy's going to talk about, and the kinds of things that he talks about in his book, we put a lot of stuff up there, and we can certainly get things from the moon, but we still have to put stuff there. And so that's really the number one challenge, and we've made a lot of progress with that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Driving down the price to low Earth orbit is key. And my entire book, Artemis, is based on the kind of presumption that the price to LEO or LEO, different people say either LEO or LEO, either way, low Earth orbit, that can be driven down substantially from where it is. And I actually wrote a paper, not a paper, but an article for Business Insider on my predictions of how low that could be, and it was all complicated and based on a lot of assumptions on my part. So you can't possibly call this science of any kind, but it was fun. It was fun to work out. And if I'm right on any percentage of this, the price to low Earth orbit can get a lot lower than it is now.
Well, and that's certainly the goal of SpaceX and Blue Origin and some of the other Virgin and some of the other launch providers. We talked briefly yesterday, Andy, and I mentioned to you that as much as I enjoyed Artemis, my favorite part of the book was that economic analysis at the end that you included in as a sort of appendix, because it really does go through how you can make this work, and how it's reasonable to expect that a commercial aspect to all of this will work. That it's not just a matter of government funding, and that there is actually a commercial incentive to make this happen.
Yeah, I've always believed that the more that we, and when I say we, I mean humanity, work on getting the price of low Earth orbit down, it will eventually reach a point where a typical middle class person can go to low Earth orbit as a vacation. It'll be a really pricey vacation, but a vacation, something that is within the reach of the average person. When that happens, it'll suddenly shift from being like an onerous expense to a major for-profit enterprise. And that's when you'll start to see the real significant advances. And to which I point to, look at all the stuff that happened in the aviation industry between, say, 1930 and 1960. That's just a 30-year span. In 1930, doing a transatlantic flight got you a parade, right? Charles Lindbergh was in 1928 or something like that. In 1960, you could just buy a ticket. I mean, when there's that much money to be made, there's they figure out how to do it fast.
yeah. And the key scene is 2001, when you see the passenger liner.
Pan Am. Glad to see they're going to be making a comeback.
Exactly. And that was what we saw, as you mentioned, in the 60s. TWA and Pan Am, when all of a sudden we had this nice, comfortable trip. I don't know how long it's going to be before we're flying in that type of vehicle, but you never know.
Well,
with in Artemis, they get back and forth in just cycler space stations, and so the only vehicles they use are to get to the cycler and get down from the cycler. So a cycler can be real big. That's like investing in a hotel. It's a one-time cost. Well, and then there's probably a little bit of maintenance to do on a massive space station. I don't know. That's up to you propeller heads to work out.
Well, and we just saw just yesterday, in fact, Virgin Galactic showed off their interior design for their cabin, and there's been a lot of effort put into making that part of the experience a very pleasant one and an enjoyable one. But it's nice to hear about the cycler as well. I know Buzz Aldrin would be would be thrilled to hear you mention that.
Well, Buzz is all about Earth-Mars cyclers.
Yeah.
This is the cycler in Artemis. Well, there are many of them, but they're all based on the Uphoff-Crouch cycler trajectory that was worked out in the 1980s. And it's awesome. I put a lot of time and effort into learning and understanding it, and I tried not to bore the reader too much with it. But what's cool is that I got an email from one of them, Uphoff or Crouch, I forget. One of them has passed away, but the other one is still with us. And he emailed and he's like, "Hey, it was pretty neat to see that in the book." You
know? That's a very fulfilling to get that kind of response. Good. Well, as we're cycling through all of this, and as we're and staying on the moon,
yes, yeah.
I mean, there's some pretty significant technical challenges that we have to consider. To begin with, it's kind of an inhospitable environment, and the sun is a big part of that. And so, Alex, can you talk a little bit about the kinds of things that we have to deal with when we're trying to exist in space, either on the way to or on the moon or on the way to, especially somewhere as distant as Mars? What do we have to get through?
Well, we have two main things to think about. One are cosmic rays, and the other one are solar energetic particles. And they actually have an interesting relationship with each other. The sun has this cycle, roughly of 11 years, of being active to not being active. And it turns out that when the sun is very active, you're going to have transient events, these huge eruptions that are going to spray out very, very energetic particles, bursts of particle radiation, ionizing radiation. But they don't happen all the time. But at the same time, you have this background of cosmic rays that's always there. These are coming from distant supernova. But when the sun is active, it actually pushes these cosmic rays out. So the cosmic rays, the background of them is less. And then when the sun is quiet and you don't have these huge eruptions and explosions, the cosmic rays are much higher. And so those are two different types of radiation, both particle radiation that you have to deal with. And when we're in low Earth orbit with the ISS, we still have some protection from the Earth's magnetic field, as well as even a little bit of atmospheric protection. Those are the two big shields that we have here on Earth to keep us from getting fried. But you're getting about 80 times the standard radiation that a human is getting, background radiation on the ground at the ISS level. And then as you move out of low Earth orbit and you're no longer dealing with the magnetic field, you still have some impact with things called the Van Allen radiation belts, which are part of the magnetic field that are creating these bubbles, magnetic bubbles that are collecting particles. So that's an area you pass through. But then by the time you get to the moon, you're kind of open. You're exposed to space, so to speak. You're exposed to, in particular, these cosmic rays. The good thing is the trip to the moon is relatively short. Once you get there, then you don't have an atmosphere, you don't have a magnetic field, but you can use protection in terms of shielding in your enclosure. For example, Andy talks about the domes in Artemis. With I think it's a couple of centimeters of material,
6 centimeters,
6 centimeters. But then there's a big layer of rock, and then you have another layer of the 6 centimeters, and that actually is pretty good protection from radiation. You can also use things like water. Water is a great shield. So you could imagine maybe you build an enclosure where you have the pipes and the water system on the outside to add protection. But that's a huge thing you have to think about. You have to think about this radiation. And then when you go to Mars, you're going to be exposed for a really long time. And that's really one of the big issues. Long-term exposure to radiation not only increases your chance of things like cancer, but it can deteriorate your nervous system, your eyes, your ocular system. And there's a huge amount of study about this. And so this is still one of the biggest challenges. We have to study the sun to know when these events are going to occur, or at least predict them as best we can, to say, hey, run, duck, and cover. Go in, shelter yourself, because there's going to be a big solar explosion. It's going to give you a burst, a relatively short burst of high intensity radiation, maybe on the order of minutes to hours, sometimes longer. But then when the sun is not very active, then you have this much higher exposure to cosmic rays from every direction. Exactly.
Can I
these
just?
are really big issues. Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Sorry. Just I'm not the solar expert. I'm just an enthusiast at science. I'm not any sort of actual, scientist. But some other things I just wanted to just add on to. Also, when you're on ISS, you have Earth itself blocking half of the radiation from space.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that's a big boon. And obviously, you don't have that when you're doing a translunar injection or when you're on your way to Mars. And then once again, when you're on Mars or on the moon, you have that body blocking half of the GCRs, the badly named galactic cosmic rays, which are just high energy particles. One thing that's really cool is that correct me if I'm wrong, Alex, the what do you call it? I'm sorry, the solar radiation moves at like on the order of 400 kilometers a second, something like that.
Oh no! So here's the thing. You're thinking. So there are three different aspects to the sun. You have a flash of electromagnetic light, which is called a solar flare.
Okay.
That takes 8 minutes to get to you. That's not as big of a deal. That impacts technology, communications, things like that. There is a big explosion of material, billions of tons, called a coronal mass ejection. That actually travels relatively slow, only millions of miles an hour. But what happens is that thing travels through space and scoops up particles kind of like a snow shovel and accelerates them. That creates the solar energetic particle burst. And those things are traveling close to the speed of light. So they get here in 10 to 20 minutes, not quite 8 minutes, but you don't have a lot of warning when those things happen.
Well, because what I was thinking is like, I'm like the 9 millionth person to think of this, but Earth is a lot closer to the sun than wherever you'll be when you're on your way to Mars. So as Earth finds out about this, they can warn you at the speed of light, which hopefully will outrun the wave that's heading toward you.
That's true, because the issue with the coronal mass ejection is that has impact on the planet itself, which will impact things like communication. So when they impact the Earth, they give us things like the aurora, and that is disturbance that gives you the aurora is creating an electrical disturbance in the atmosphere, which is going to mess with your ability to communicate. Because here's the other thing. We're sending people, the radiation is an issue, but we certainly don't want something that's going to knock out our ability to communicate. We already have the difficulty that as we move farther and farther away, it takes longer because light, is only traveling so fast.
Light is really slow when you get down to it. It is annoyingly slow.
It is annoyingly slow, especially when you move away from the Earth.
Yeah, that's why we need Ansibles. Real quick question from the audience for Andy. Would being underground on the moon protect you from radiation? I
like how that's like directed at me, not the guy who's an expert on. No, let's ask Andy. Yes, it would. I'm sure Alex will agree. It just depends on how much underground you are. Everything protects you from radiation to some degree. It's just a matter of how much of it you put between you and yourself. For Artemis, I did the math. Maybe I did it wrong, but I have 6 centimeters of aluminum, followed by a meter of crushed lunar regolith, followed by another 6 centimeters of aluminum. And according to my math, that brings the radiation levels inside, including GCRs and everything, inside down to kind of roughly the same radiation levels as you'd have on the surface of Earth. And the reason I did all that instead of water is like way the hell more effective. Hydrogen in general is really, really good at stopping radiation, but they don't have that on the moon, or they do, but not convenient. Whereas there are an awful lot of rocks to crush up. So that was my approach. Perhaps the scientific expert on these things might be able to offer more information.
No, but you're exactly right. I mean, it's really just a matter of how much stuff you put in there. There are different kinds of particles. The more energetic they are, the farther they go. and also the bigger they are. You can have things like the nuclei of atoms, which are accelerated. Those things have a little bit more punch to them. But yeah, it's just about how much stuff you put there. And that's really the same thing we do in a nuclear reactor. You just put a lot of stuff between you and the source of radiation. And so, yeah, the calculations that you have are as far as I know, they're spot on in terms of the levels that you have. But it's pretty much that simple. It's just that fortunately there are a lot of rocks there because we can't
Yeah.
carry. It's not like we can carry lead bricks with us. I mean, lead's great, but you can't.
Kind of heavy,
you can't
though.
shoot a bunch of lead bricks into space. So
Kind of heavy.
kind
So,
of heavy, yeah.
And thanks to the people who are asking questions in the comments. Please do feel free to do that, and we're gonna keep popping up more as we go along. Really appreciate it. One question that I just saw popping up is: would it even be possible to create an artificial magnetic field strong enough to protect a spacecraft from radiation?
Not with our. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, on that sort of scale, I mean, there's actually been a lot of people that have done speculations about it. As a matter of fact, there's a great article in Scientific American back in the '80s. It was written by Eugene Parker, if anyone has heard of the Parker Solar Probe, which is traveling close to the sun, he did some calculations and speculations like, what if you created a large electric field? What if you created a large magnetic field? You can do that, but doing it on the scale of what you would need is quite difficult. Now, one of the things that people like Jim Green, former head of planetary and now the chief scientist for NASA, he's thought about that in terms of how would you terraform, And one of the things you have to do for terraforming Mars is you've got to stop the atmospheric loss, which is happening when those CMEs and things are blasting by the solar wind. They're stripping away the atmosphere. You could, in fact, put something out front of Mars and maybe make a large magnetic field. But putting one around a spacecraft is difficult. Certainly putting one around a larger enclosure where you have a lot of people is even more difficult because it requires a lot of energy. But when you create a magnetic field that's strong enough to protect you from those particles, the magnetic field itself becomes dangerous. You don't really want to sit in a huge, mini,
Do you want to?
super Gauss.
Would you like to live in an MRI?
Right.
Like-
Well, imagine living in an MRI or something that's even 10, 100, 1,000 times stronger than MRI. It's going to start messing with you. It's just not going to be very good. Yeah. So,
Side note on the subject of radiation in general, I have a sneaking suspicion. Now, I might no longer be on this planet I might no longer be alive by the time this is resolved, but I suspect that the solution to all of these problems will come from the medical sector, not from the technology sector. I think that I know this is a weird thing to say, I think it's easier to cure cancer than it is to solve all the problems related with space radiation for traveling.
well, that is actually, that's a really good point, because one of the things we're trying to do is figure out how to heal the damage, heal our cells, for example. I mean, we do know there are certain organisms that can live in high radiation because our cells are constantly healing themselves. The problem is when you're hit with enough radiation, they simply can't keep up. Okay, so
and they also get base pair changes that make them go
they get blasted.
cancerous.
Yeah, I mean, you have DNA that's split apart when these particles hit them, and so what if you could address that? So I think that's a good point, addressing it from the biological aspect. The other thing is, one of the things that people at NASA and other areas are doing is also thinking about other types of materials. They're even developing clothing, various types of polyesters that are embedded with certain other things, boron and other elements, which actually help to additionally shield. So then that's very light. That's another area. I mean, you could do lots of different things. Maybe not just one individual thing, but a whole series of different things.
So another question, can we scavenge oxygen from the silicates on the moon, or is the process too energy intensive?
My whole book is based on this.
That's right. That's right. Absolutely.
Yes, you absolutely can get oxygen from the silicates on the moon. I think oxygen is like one of the most common elements on the moon. It's all in the form of rocks. And it takes a lot of energy to pull the oxygen molecules off of things like anorthite, which is a very common mineral on the moon. But it can be done. I found the process online. It's called the FFC Cambridge process. Is one fairly efficient way of doing it, which is pretty new technology. Actually, it was a chemical process invented in the 1990s. But it requires an amount of energy such that you would need to have a reactor. So within the book, when I was designing Artemis as a city, I said, they would start by putting a reactor and a smelter and some gathering stuff so that they could then start manufacturing metal to build the rest of the base. But reactors, we think of reactors as being big, heavy things, but in the grand scheme of things, there are some pretty small reactors that pack a punch, like, for instance, the kind that power our nuclear submarines. And so you can get something like 15 megawatts E/75 megawatt heat nuclear reactor that weighs on the order of, I think, 10 metric tons. I mean, that's not bad. If you can for instance, the Apollo lander, like the Eagle, weighed about 12,000 kilograms. So we're talking about that same level of mass. Get that to the moon, and then you have enough energy that you can start smelting. So not only do you get the oxygen you need to breathe, but much more importantly, your byproduct is a bunch of metal, usually aluminum. And aluminum's wonderful. Right. Yeah, melt it, machine it, boil them, mash them, stick them in a stew. You can do everything with aluminum.
Well, and then once you do that, then you've got all the water ice that's sitting at the South Pole.
If it's there within, I know it's there, but if it's feasible, within my fictional world, they just ship hydrogen to the moon, and then they react it with their massive excess of oxygen to make the water. So for every kilogram of hydrogen you send to Artemis, they can make 9 kilograms of water. Because the oxygen's the heavy part of water, not the hydrogen.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
But I was going to say, but like I said, I'm just a writer. It's so easy to be a hard sci-fi writer because you say, look, this is physically possible. Therefore, the people do it. But the details of making these things happen take generations of scientists to actually work out. But that's not my problem.
The devil's in the details. Yeah.
And I think we're seeing a tremendous amount of new technology just in the last few years that's being applied to this, and that's making all of this possible, from reusable rockets that are reducing the cost to launch to things like 3D printers. And I know my friends at Made in Space, Andy, helpfully shared with you the fact that if Mark Watney had only had a 3D printer on Mars, he could have solved all his problems. Can you tell us a little bit about that exchange?
I don't know if he could have solved all of his problems. He still would have been stranded there, but he could have repaired things a little bit easier. Yeah. 3D printers or generally the ability to manufacture replacement parts in situ is really important if you're going to be prohibitive English. It is my first language, I swear. Prohibitively far away from Earth. So if you're on a mission, on your way to Mars, it's nice to be able to make a widget whenever you need to, or if you're on Mars or on your way back. For lunar missions, I'm not sure that that's that critical. I mean, because whatever the thing is that broke, you can probably just live without it for the duration of that one mission. Or if it's something absolutely critical that broke, you should have secondary and tertiary systems. So, I don't know that it's that critical for a comparatively short duration mission profile like lunar missions. Mm-hmm. But Mars for sure.
Mars, yeah, you're very far away, yeah.
Yeah. As I like to often tell people, if you were on a football field, if Earth is at one end of a football field and Mars is at the other end, the moon would be at the 4-inch line. So that gives people a concept of scale of how far away. Like people are like, "Oh, we went to the moon. Why not Mars?" It's like because.
Well, and the moon would be at and Mars would be at the 100-yard line or the other end zone.
The other side of the field.
Only every 18 months.
Well, yeah, okay, yes, yeah. Only every synod.
Right,
yeah.
and then we'd have to wait for it to come around the same side of the sun again. So it's
true. The moon is really convenient because it orbits us. It's always about the same distance away.
Yeah.
But Mars is not so cooperative.
So, a new question: why not build the spacecraft to Mars surrounded by water tanks? It would need to be assembled in space, but could be launched through multiple trips from the Earth.
Mass.
Yeah.
So the more it's shielding, the more you have to push, right? Is that your?
Yeah. So much mass.
I mean, water is great. Water is necessary for everything, but water is really massive. I mean.
Yeah. Unfortunately, in space, itself, you have no resources to make use of. Once you get to Mars or the moon and stuff, and there's a lot of discussion about using the moon as a stepping stone, which I'm sure we'll get into a bunch here. But if you make useful products or mass on the moon, it's a lot easier to get that into space because moon's gravity well is so much easier to escape. So if you wanted to do something like make a spaceship that has a double hold system full of water in the middle, you could get a lot of that mass from the moon. And then you don't have to lift that off of Earth.
And that's why we think about things like, using asteroids as a stepping stone to go somewhere, using it as a resource, a place to mine and gather resources. But I mean, that is the whole point, that is a major point about the Artemis program. It is a stepping stone to Mars.
And that's something that we wanted to bring up. We did a poll beforehand asking folks whether they would rather go to the moon or Mars, and it turns out we got 58% wanted to would prefer to go to Mars if they had the choice, and then the rest would prefer to go to the moon. I'm curious to begin with which you two would prefer. And then let's talk a little bit about the value of the moon as a stepping stone versus a potential direct shot to Mars.
Alex?
Well, I mean, I guess, if I'm impatient, I'd rather go to the moon. It's a lot closer. I mean, I want to go to space. I absolutely want to go to space. So in that context, getting to the moon is significantly easier, significantly less hazardous. I mean, sure, if I could get to Mars through a Stargate, that would be much easier. But I don't know that I really want to travel, at least not right now. I don't want to be one of the first people to go. And more power to those who want to do it. Though I suppose as I get older and older, it's probably better. I mean, I can handle a lot more radiation as I get older.
Yep.
So.
Yeah, the older you get, the less radiation is an issue because the radiation dosage you get increases your long-term chances of cancer. But if you don't have much long-term chances of life anyway, it doesn't really matter.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's funny. Some people did. I'm sorry, this is an aside, but some scientists with I guess not anything better to do did a full analysis of like how much radiation each member of the Ares 3 crew would have received, like during the course of the book. Of the Martian. And actually, Mark Watney gets the least amount because the rest of the crew are in the Hermes, their ship, almost the entire time, whereas Watney has Mars blocking half of the radiation most of his time. And the worst off would be Johansson because she's young, she's the youngest, and she's female. And for some reason that we don't yet understand, women are more susceptible to cancer from radiation than men are. We don't know why, very slightly so, but we don't know why. And the younger you are, the more likely you are to die as a result of radiation-induced cancer. Right. So Johansson really gets the short end of the stick on that one, if you're curious. Yeah, sorry.
Go ahead,
Alex.
Sorry, you go ahead.
In answer to the original question, I am an earthbound misfit. I write about brave people. I'm not one of them. I don't want to leave this planet at all. But if I could Stargate, teleport, whatever, I'd actually go to the moon because I would love to just look up and see Earth.
Yeah, I would love to see Earthrise. I think that would be really cool.
Well, you can't see Earth rise unless you're
Well,
orbiting the moon.
I know, but I would love to see Earth.
Oh,
Watching you.
Yeah.
wow. Pulling out
So
tidal walking, very nice. So I think we've got.
I mean, I do have to get there from orbit, so you know.
That's true. That's true. And if you're in just the right place, lunar libration might cause the Earth to kind of go up and down on the horizon a little bit.
That's enough.
That's enough.
So, Brian Boswell asks, distance aside, what new challenges will a Martian colony face that wouldn't be addressed by a lunar colony? What other than just being so far away? What are they going to have to deal with? Do you think?
Well, I mean, I in this case, I would actually say definitely Andy's the expert. But I mean, my first thought is the distance, the time is a huge thing. I mean, you know, we can get to the moon in a relatively short period of time. If you need stuff, you can get there. Obviously, it's a good stepping stone, and it's easier to get stuff onto Mars because of the 1/6 the gravity. But if you're in trouble, you can get there and you get help. If you're
You
at
can get
Mars,
home.
first off, yeah. But if you're on Mars, you're on your own, and the time to communicate back and forth is incredibly long. But I'll let Andy go to more of the details. I know you've thought a lot about this.
I have. But interesting. The phrasing of the question was distance aside, right? Well, whether that's BS, that was I know, and I knew at the time that I wrote it that windstorms on Mars can't do damage as depicted in the book, but it was a human versus nature story, and I wanted nature to get the first punch. And at the time I wrote it, I'm like, no one will know. And then people are like, Andy Weir's book is really accurate, except for this one part. Let's all talk about that.
Oh
But
no,
anyway,
trust me, all of us scientists were like, "Oh, come on, you couldn't even blow a tissue over. What are you talking about?"
I know,
We
I
were
know.
all thinking about that. So
I know. And I even had, as I wrote it, I'm like, this is wrong, but I decided to do it anyway. I had another scenario in mind where they're doing an engine test on the MAV and there's a problem and it explodes and it kind of causes the sequence of events but it just wasn't as cool. So every now and then when you're a writer, you got to let the rule of cool take over. Anyway, the phrasing of the question was distance issues aside. I would say that Mars is way easier to deal with if it weren't for the distance. Like if Mars and the moon were the same distance apart, and for some reason Earth weren't being torn apart by the effects of that, if Mars was as easy to get to as the moon, then you would definitely want to go to Mars. It would be so much easier.
absolutely,
It's easier to land there. There's way more resources there. There's water there. There's everything you need. You would the question was like, oh, what's harder about Mars and the moon other than distance? Nothing. Like literally nothing. Everything is better on Mars than it is on the moon. It's just the distance.
Thanks for the question. Great comment from the comments. I've read The Martian and Artemis over 5 times, and I love all your books. I've read The Egg too. You write the best. Zach Johnson, 10 years old. Thank you, Zach.
Thanks, Zach.
Appreciate your being on tonight.
Hey, Zach, I think you should know my parents almost named me Zach. They were when they said like, oh, if it's a boy, it's going to be either Zach or Andy. But then they decided that my middle name was going to be Taylor, which is a family name that comes from my grandmother's side, and they didn't want to name me Zachary Taylor Weir because Zachary Taylor was a president. So that's why I ended up Andy. But I was this close to being named Zach. So we're almost name buddies, almost.
There's an interesting. I was just going to say an interesting question coming up. What do you think immigration would look like in an age of space travel and lunar colonization? Obviously, it's a very hot topic right now, and we've seen in previous waves of migration and previous new territories, there have been different approaches taken to immigration. Sometimes it's a high priority effort. Sometimes it's the criminals who get sent. What do you think is likely to happen?
Alex, you want to go first, or shall I?
go for it.
All right.
I mean, there's some aspects of Artemis that kind of address that.
The earliest days of space exploration and colonization, immigration won't be any sort of issue. It'll be like, if you can get there, good on you. It's like there were no immigration quotas in North America in the 1700s.
Well, the key there is the money. I mean,
the cost of getting there is so prohibitive that immigration only becomes an issue when it starts affecting an already well-established economy. So from a political standpoint, we're talking about centuries from now before people even care about immigrants going from one place to another. That's when you'll, build a wall and make the Martians pay for it. But until then, I don't think immigration is going to be a problem at all. As for Artemis, in fictional Artemis, my book, they have that same policy. If you can get here, you can live here. I mean, that's it. I mean, you gotta pay for stuff. We don't take care of you, but it's a frontier town.
So there's been a question raised that I'd like to just address real briefly because it's about quantum communication. And Alex, I know that you started off in sort of quantum science before moving over to heliophysics, and I moonlight as the executive director of the Quantum Industry Coalition. So the question is, here it is. Any thoughts on entangled particles communication or quantum communication for instant communications?
Sorry, man. You can't.
Well, you can't do it. I'm afraid the
so
problem
sorry.
is you can't. I mean, the thing to think about. We talk about the speed limit, but really the speed of light. It's not the speed of light. It's the speed of information. I mean, that's the limit. That's the rule. And as cool as quantum entanglement is, people have been able to do experiments at this point, and it continues to be the rule we can't get past.
Yeah, it's the speed. The C is not really the speed of light. It's the speed of reality. It's just. Yeah. It is what it is, which is another thing when people ask me about what's your explanation for the Fermi paradox? Why haven't we seen aliens yet? Or why aren't there aliens and stuff like that? To which I say, I don't think anyone will ever be able to travel faster than light or send information faster than light. So there could be intelligent aliens in the Andromeda galaxy. Well, we can't possibly say hi in under 2 million years. So, yeah. Quantum stuff, I mean, it's fun. It's fun to mess around with.
It's very cool.
It's super cool. It's horrible and neat and awful and great. It is both wonderful and terrible simultaneously.
Well, I mean, one of the things to think about is the bubble of how far the sign of our existence exists is only about 100 years.
Yeah, like 100 light years from Earth.
Yeah, that's how far the very first radio signals have traveled. There's a bubble around us, so there is no information about our existence, at least our modern technological existence, after that.
Unless you're
get past that.
Unless you're like some super, advanced alien life form that is able to detect, the presence of life from emissions of the planet. It's like, there's some aliens 50,000 light years away, like halfway across the galaxy, and they can look at Earth and see the total amount of energy going into the planet is a little bit less than the total energy coming out. That must mean that there are life forms sequestering the energy, so there's probably life on that planet. But one way or another, it still comes down to the light from that event has to make it out to there. So,
and we're limited by how fast light can travel. We're limited how fast gravitational waves can travel,
which is approximately the speed of light.
That's right. So, I mean, I personally think, just in terms of thinking about some science fiction, science fact. We're not going to travel faster than the speed of light, so maybe if we can bend space, maybe if we can, travel, make holes in space, like the idea of a wormhole. I mean, there are all sorts of issues with the amount of energy and everything that would require, but...
Once we become a Kardashev 2, or
But
whatever.
that's the only way you can break that limitation. Space itself is not limited by that. That's why space expanding is actually not limited by that.
Right.
But you can't get around it. When in your space, you can't get around the limit of information travel.
But what that's another one of those things I think ultimately gets solved by medicine. If the human lifespan becomes 20,000 years, then you're like, sure, I'll go to Alpha Centauri. It only takes 4 years. And hell, I only experienced some, less than that.
So we've talked about some of the technical challenges. We've talked about some of the economic challenges, and now I'd like to, based on one of the questions I've seen pop up, talk about some of the political challenges. Somebody's asked, what about different countries sending people to colonize? Wouldn't that divide the Martian or lunar landscape? And right now, we're operating under the Outer Space Treaty, which prevents anybody from claiming territory on a celestial body. But Andy got around that, and the Artemis Accords, which are our international agreements to implement the Artemis program, are focused on setting some rules of the road around this. Also, the Commercial Space Launch Competitiveness Act back in 2015 created or recognized a property right in resources that you obtain from space. And so once you pick it up, once it's no longer real property, once it's no longer land but is stuff, then you can own that from the US's perspective. But I'm curious what you think about the potential for conflict, both between countries on a celestial body's surface, and also, as in the case of The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, a novel that I very much enjoy, between the colony and the mother country.
Well, that gets into the realm of potentially future politics and complicated stuff like that. But as you mentioned, in the short term, the Outer Space Treaty, I mean, the grand scheme of things, the moon is just part of the ocean from a legal standpoint. It's international waters, and so all the same rules apply. If you built a moon base there, that's the same as having an oil platform out in the ocean, like an oil drilling platform. And an oil platform is the same as a boat, legally. So your moon base is technically a boat. It has to fly the flag of some nation. That nation is responsible for the laws within that thing, but nobody can claim territory. So unless the Outer Space Treaty changed in some significant way, you wouldn't have these kinds of issues. But I mean, it's impossible to imagine the political situation of of a colony in the distant future.
Yeah.
One interesting element of the duty to avoid harmful interference with ongoing operations on a celestial body is that can create almost a de facto property right, in that if you are present in a certain area and you are certified safe as long as somebody doesn't come within 100 meters of you, then you have a de facto property right to the area 100 meters around you.
In any scenario where you have written agreements, there are always going to be edge cases that can be argued, right? Yeah. And if you define yourself as, I'm not safe if you're within 99 meters of me, well, then that's the sort of thing where you end up in some sort of UN court. I'm not sure.
Or just fighting it out on the lunar surface.
Well, that's definitely not allowed by the Outer Space Treaty. Exciting though it does make it for film and television, or in the case of Heinlein, where we have in The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, where they just straight up declare independence from Earth, and they say not only are we claiming territory, we're saying it's our territory, and gesture deleted, but yeah. Once again, it's one of those things where everyone agrees on high-minded ideals until people are actually there and money's actually in play. Then the realities set in. In the same way that nobody can claim territory in the ocean, but if you try to set up an oil drilling rig 10 feet from some other country's oil drilling rig, you're going to have some disputes on that.
Well, and in the case of Artemis, of course, you had a very interesting approach to that went through Kenya. If you want to just for folks who may be a little rusty on that, just go through that one more time, and how did you decide that process?
Well, what I decided Artemis is a tourist destination. The only way for that to happen is for the price of space travel to go way down. So in my fictional world, the nation of Kenya made a concerted effort to become the kind of center for space technology and development and for-profit enterprises. And the way they did that was, and I've heard this from many people in the space industry, that one of the main limiters now, the main limiter to accomplishing cool little things in space is no longer technology, it's policy. There's a group, I wish I could remember their name, maybe one of you knows, they want to win the Lunar X Prize by being the first people to put a little probe on the moon, and they're going to hitch a ride in the stage separation fairing of a booster going up for some other reason. Anyway, one of their biggest problems is they're like, oh yeah, we got it all worked out, but one of the rules is you need to use these antiquated FM broadcast frequencies so the US federal government can watch you to make sure you're not violating the Outer Space Treaty. And that's an American law, not an OST law. And so policy gets in their way, and they have to have way more battery power, et cetera, et cetera. So what Kenya does is they say, we're going to get out of your way. If we're making all these special rules for the space industry. You can kind of do whatever you want. Even our labor laws aren't going to apply to the space industry. And we're going to set aside this area to be owned by the Kenya Space Corporation, which is made of owned by lots and lots of other corporations worldwide. Also, Kenya's on the equator, which gives you the maximum benefit of Earth's rotation while launching. And Kenya, you would launch east. So that means you're launching out over the ocean, which is the safest way to launch. And so they put all that together and said, come to Kenya and set it up, and we'll make it happen. And in my book, that worked. They became the kind of Earth's real center of space travel. And then that company, the Kenya Space Corporation, built Artemis for profit. They said oh, well, we think this can make money. Tourists will go there.
Excellent. Well, thank you. And as Jim Gable just noted, it's
thank you, Jim Gable.
Aspect and certainly one of mine as well. So there's been a question about what space commerce might look like in an age of travel or lunar colonies. We're just starting to see the very beginnings of space tourism and some indications that there's.
I think
space Applebee's.
I think it would look kind of like this. I mean, it's commerce. What do you want? I mean, it's not any different. I have something you want. You have something I want, and
so you think it will be depressingly pedestrian?
Yeah, I mean, I think commerce is just another fancy word for an economy, and so if you have a civilization, it has an economy. You can't have one without the other. So, yeah, commerce would just be part of that, unless you have a commune.
Even that is an economy of sorts.
Yeah. I mean, it is an economy, but a commune technically doesn't have commerce. But even if you look at Israeli kibbutzes and stuff like that, I'm not even joking around. A kibbutz is usually about 100 people or so, and it is a true exercise of communism. And a lot of people think that's about the biggest population you can have and have functional communism. Any larger and it starts to fall apart. But even within a kibbutz, there's commerce. There's somebody who's okay, I'll take, okay, you're supposed to be working today, but you're sick, so I'll do that, and you catch me on another day when I want to take. There's always a little bit of independent bartering and trading.
Yeah.
Well, I think the idea of commerce being boring and pedestrian is actually critical.
Yeah.
So much of what we want to do here, so much of what we're trying to do here is make this boring.
Yeah, in a way, yeah.
and so I think that's really worthwhile. So this was an earlier question that we addressed on the question of colonization and conflict between countries. I think it's interesting to think about the transition from for the commerce and the boring aspect of it, the transition from exploration, which is what we're doing right now, to expansion. The difference between, for example, the Lewis and Clark expedition and the wagon trains, and it seems to me that we're just at the beginning of that hinge in history between those two periods.
Yeah, and this time we don't have to kill off a bunch of people to take their land first.
Yes,
which is a bonus.
Yes,
that's kind of cool this time.
Yep. Someone has asked, relating back to the question of a space economy, are there plausible space industries that we can do on the moon more effectively on the Earth that would be profitable enough to drive the expansion of lunar industry? And of course, you've discussed tourism at length in Artemis as such an industry, there's the potential for from microgravity manufacturing on the International Space Station and outside of a real gravitational field for the most part that's out there. But what are some other things that you've come across, Andy and Alex? Are you seeing anything from within NASA that might offer some opportunities?
Well, I can talk about, it's not so much traditional ideas, but at least from a science point of view. Okay, so the moon offers a unique platform to do science. I mean, I think it's just sort of a side thing I wanted to point out. I mean, so I grew up in school, beginning into science and then into grad school in the age of the great observatories, Hubble, Chandra, Spitzer, GRO. I worked for the Gamma Ray Observatory, which was a lot of mass. You need a lot of mass to stop this. So those type of spacecraft are probably a thing of the past. We're not going to have too many of them. I mean, we have James Webb, but that's a massive thing that's taken a huge amount of resources from NASA. So we're not going to be able to cover everything with all these different giant spacecraft. And we can't put a giant telescope the size that we could put here on the top of Mauna Kea or something like that. But you could do it on the moon. You can build the resources.
Great place for an observatory.
And so you can make observatories that don't have any atmosphere. You can make things massively big, and because you have people there, you can fix them. And so that addresses all these issues. So
very predictable weather.
Very predictable weather. And so this is one of the things that the scientists like myself are super excited about. The moon as a platform for doing science is going to be really, really a game changer. I think we're going to see over the next couple of decades and beyond, we're going to see science that we've never been able to do before using that as a so. And of course, just because we're doing science doesn't mean there isn't commerce and industry associated with that. They're going to be, I mean, we do science through NASA, but we support for-profit industry like, the Lockheed Martins and Honeywells and whatnot, who are helping to build a lot of these instrumentation. So it's going to be a huge change in what we can do in science, and pretty exciting.
Great. Well, thank you. I want to just mention we're coming up on an hour. We can continue as long as we've got questions, and as long as Andy and Alex and the technical team are able to keep going. We do have an interesting question about are people looking at the technologies needed to successfully mine the asteroid belt to acquire the materials needed for a spacefaring society? And as somebody who helped draft and pass the asteroid mining law, I can say yes. I'll leave it to the two of you to elaborate.
I think this is probably more Alex's bailiwick. I remember when the asteroid law was announced, and I was like, "Good." I mean, it's very similar to it's very similar in structure to international waters. If you go out into the ocean, if you catch a fish, that's your fish, right?
Yeah, yeah.
If you go out into space, you pick up an asteroid, that's your asteroid. But Alex,
Well, I mean, some of the current priorities in technology have changed. I mean, it used to be that we were literally going to go out and rope an asteroid, so to speak, and that was a big focus. And a lot of that technology is still being developed. But yeah, we're still doing things. But the technologies that we're going to be using to mine an asteroid, there's a lot of similarities with the things we'll be using to mine the moon. But a lot of the technologies to get to an asteroid and to interact with an asteroid have already been or already being developed. I mean, we have several science missions that are interacting with comets and asteroids. We have the OSIRIS-REx mission, which the spacecraft has been orbiting Bennu, the asteroid, in order to find its landing place. But it's going to go down to the surface and have a vacuum cleaner. It's going to suck up many pounds of material from the asteroid. And so those kinds of technologies that are being developed to do science are the same kind of technologies you're going to need to eventually, mine an asteroid. And even the technologies for the mining developed for lunar and maybe even someday Mars are still going to apply. So there's a lot of crossover there.
I would like to be the negative Nancy here a little bit and say that, like, when it comes to mining asteroids, just in terms of pure resources, I guarantee you it's easier to get that resource from Earth than it is to go to an asteroid and get it. So the benefit of mining asteroids is to have those resources already out of Earth's gravity well. So you're like, I want to make steel so I can make a spaceship. And then so you get the materials from an asteroid, and now you don't have to bring them up off Earth. But then a little bit more negative, Nancy, I'm sorry. I still think that, asteroid mining sounds fantastic, but whatever it is you want to get from an asteroid, you can probably get from the moon. And the moon is, once again, very conveniently hanging out near Earth all the time.
Yeah.
and it's a lot closer than any asteroid, and it's very large, and it has just about anything you might want. I was actually, for Artemis, when I was doing my research, I'm like, can you make steel? And the thing I found was that the moon is actually pretty low on nickel. It's got everything else. I mean, it's got tons of iron. It's actually got a non-trivial amount of chromium, believe it or not. And so you would need to import carbon, but you don't need a lot of carbon to make steel. However, you do need nickel, and the moon just doesn't have much nickel. So I was thinking, like, but if you go to meteor impact sites, I bet you some of them have a bunch of nickel in the middle, because there are pure nickel meteors out there, or asteroids out there. So anyway, I was actually trying to put together an Artemis story based on that, but
let me ask you, Andy. So, do you think that? And I totally agree with you. I mean, really, the cost of doing asteroid mining, it's not really for bringing things back here. I mean, they're not a huge resource for bringing things back here. It's for space. But do you think maybe these would be resources far in the future when we take longer trips farther away, that we want resources along the way? Do you think maybe that
I see, like way stations, kind of like?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, sure. Like I said, like, my opinion, and again, I'm not even a real scientist like Alex is, I'm just some guy. But my opinion is that asteroid mining, the primary use for it will be the benefits you get from acquiring resources that you want that are already outside of Earth's gravitational well. So whatever you want to do off of Earth, that it would be nice to have those resources handy. Like, there are a lot of there are a lot of celestial bodies out there that have way less gravity than Earth that have a lot of water. So that's handy because you can make fuel out of that and so on.
So two questions that I think are interesting from a science fiction perspective. One is, have you read Verne's From the Earth to the Moon, and what do you think about his predictions of what lunar travel would look like? Nothing like
Well,
author predictions. So let's have that.
It turns out that you can't just get in a big cannon and fire yourself to the moon. The initial gravity, the initial force on that might be a bit much. Also, there were like beings on the moon, and there was a breathable atmosphere on the moon. So I don't think I'd call From the Earth to the Moon like hard sci-fi, but it was really cool in that it was one of the early pieces of legitimate, proper science fiction.
Yeah.
And it's a cool story.
It's a cool story.
Well,
absolutely.
I think a second question, really for both of you, what science fiction series beyond your own work, Andy, do you think has most positively impacted the NASA Artemis generation?
Science fiction series, or am I allowed to pick like
I'm going to moderate that one down to science fiction work of any kind.
I think maybe due to timing, 2001.
Yeah, I was gonna say, just in general, I think a lot of Arthur C. Clarke. 2001. Even things like Childhood's End, Rendezvous with Rama. I mean, a lot of those really were, I think, very inspirational to my generation, the generation before me, and then some Heinlein, but
I think we can agree Heinlein's terrible, right? The two of us, Alex, we can agree. And anybody who likes Heinlein is probably Heinlein had some great, hard sci-fi in his early days. I thought that was, like you mentioned, the moon is a harsh mistress. God, what is wrong with me today? Can't speak. But that's a good one. I loved what was it? Farmer in the Sky? Yeah, that's where I got the idea of, although it isn't in the movie, Mark has to breed dirt first in the book. In The Martian, he has to first breed up the microbes in the dirt before he can then start planting things. I got that straight from Farmer in the Sky.
Nice. Question, what are the practical considerations that would differ for women on a celestial body with different gravity and different... I mean, we talked about the radiation differences. Are there other practical considerations that we need to address?
That affect women but not men? Alex, I can't think of anything that's...
I don't know. I mean, I don't know what the difference would be on how it would affect a growing fetus. I mean, I don't know, that was...
Well, yeah, pregnant women, I guess. Or children. That's a lot of questions too.
The only thing I can think of is just what would be the impact of, a human growing and developing in a lower gravity environment. Clearly, they're going to be in a position where they can't easily come back to Earth.
Right.
But there could be some issues there. I honestly don't know.
But if we're talking about like adult women who are not pregnant, I can't imagine there's any difference at all.
I can't think of any. Radiation is really the only
right,
issue.
And that is like, if you're colonizing, you better have solved that. So
right. I mean, so radiation is an issue for both the difference between men and women as well as age.
And by the way, the difference between men and women's susceptibility to radiation is it's small. It's there.
It's very small. Yeah,
it's very small. So it's not like women just turn to ash all of a sudden. It's a very small. It's just they're slightly more likely to get cancer.
There's a slight difference between the kind of what are your lifetime allowances of radiation, but it's very, very small. It actually I think it kind of evens out too it starts to even out as they get older too.
Right.
So there's another interesting question. Are there other topics that you haven't seen yet addressed in science fiction that you'd like to see tackled?
And
Andy?
Well,
You
I
use
mean,
the opportunity to plug your upcoming
I've
work.
got, yeah, I mean, when I come up with those, I tend to write a book about it. No, I think that one thing is I would like to see more science fiction that is not action. There's a kind of this implicit assumption in sci-fi that it's almost always an action movie or an action story. But to me, science fiction isn't a genre so much as part of the setting. So just as you can have an action story in New York or a love story in New York or a comedy in New York, I don't see why you can't have an action sci-fi, a love sci-fi, a comedy sci-fi. And so I would like to see it branch out more away from just pure action. And kind of my novels reflect that. Like neither of my books are really action movie, punch aliens, and the other thing is I am super duper done with dystopia. Like I don't. It's something. It's a very easy setting to write stories in, a dystopian future. But for some reason, I feel like science fiction has gotten hijacked by basically the same storyline over and over again. It's this pseudo-fascist dystopian technocracy that can only be brought down by a bunch of teenagers doing stupid things. And I don't understand. Well, I mean, I do understand. It's a very easy thing to write. It's very easy to establish fascist government. Okay, well, now the reader understands they're the bad guys. You don't need to explain it. People, oh, yeah, fascist, I get it, they're bad. And teenagers are the main characters because teenagers are the target audience. It all makes sense on why we end up with these. But I feel like we've kind of we have lost the optimism that used to follow along with science fiction. I grew up reading sci-fi, baby boomer era sci-fi, even though I'm Gen X. Grew up reading my dad's collection. So I grew up reading Heinlein, Asimov, and Clarke. And those were all very aspirational stories. If you read those books, in almost all cases, you think to yourself, I would love to live in that setting. Maybe I don't want to have the problems that particular main problem is main character is having, but that would be a cool time and setting to be alive. And like, I would not want to live in the Hunger Games, right? But I would love to live in the, that, I don't know, take your pick, the Rama universe or whatever. So I guess optimism is what I want more of. And that's what I do. I try to make aspirational sci-fi, kind of like the good old days of Star Trek, Gene Roddenberry. I mean, Star Trek, it would be awesome to live as a citizen of the Federation, like on Earth. Yeah, the Starfleet's out there getting eaten by green blobs, but you're back at home on Earth where you're a post-scarcity society. Anyway, Alex?
Hey, so I actually have to make a plug because I realize that we've passed the hour, but I forgot to mention tomorrow. So, we're talking about Mars. We're talking about the stepping stone. Tomorrow is the launch of Mars 2020 mission and the Perseverance rover. It's going to be at 7:40 a.m. Eastern Time. The launch window varies every day, but it's going to be up. They're going to be launch days every day until August 15th. And this is a next step in us understanding the conditions and the environment for life on Mars. Even for myself, there's a little bit of heliophysics in there. There's some experiments to study radiation and that sort of thing. But this is going to be really cool. This is going to be the next step. And these are the kinds of information we need if we're going to go to Mars. We have a lot to learn, and we don't want to miss out. So please, everybody go to NASA.gov to watch the live broadcast, or you might have the NASA channel, and hopefully somebody like CNN or something will also play it.
I think probably a lot of people will play it. Yeah.
I think
this is a big deal. This is exciting. Yeah,
it really is. Thank you for mentioning it. It's going to be fantastic. So I think that actually brings us to our natural stopping place. I want to thank each of you, Andy and Alex, for spending time with us this evening and for your thoughts and engagement. And thanks to the audience, just fantastic questions, lots of variety, lots of really interesting issues raised. Thank you to the Museum of Science Fiction and to Escape Velocity and the technical team supporting all of this for making this possible. And we're looking forward to further events along these lines in the very near future. And please stay tuned.
And thanks to you for guiding the conversation. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a real
Thank
pleasure
you very
to be
much. And then thanks to, I always end up in these conversations with real scientists who know what they're doing. And I'm always like, hi. Hi. I just love chatting with scientists. I learned so much. So thanks for having me.
Thanks, everybody.
I guess that's it.